Well, with just one conversation left, it's really hard to believe that this year's Common Ground Summit is almost over. But fortunately, the 6 people joining us on the stage for this final conversation are sure to help us finish strong on a topic that is bound to elicit absolutely no uncertainty whatsoever. Conservative thought in the age of President Trump. I'm honored to say that we've left this subject in very capable hands today, so please allow me to make a few introductions. Our moderator for this conversation is Mark Henrie, who currently serves as president of the Arthur N. Roop Foundation in Santa Barbara, California. Mark is a member of the Advisory Council for First Things magazine. He's also a former chief academic officer and senior vice president at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, where he edited Modern Age and the Intercollegiate Review. He was educated at Dartmouth, Cambridge, and Harvard University. Mark is joined by 5 guests, including Gregg, who holds the Mitch McConnell Chair in Leadership at the University of Louisville, where he also serves as director of the McConnell Center, hosting civic education programs for teachers and students and public events with politicians, business executives, and accomplished scholars. An award-winning teacher, Dr. Gregg is preparing Kentucky's top undergraduate students to become future leaders. The author or editor of numerous books, he's also a former national director of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Next up is Elisabeth Lasch-Quinn, professor of history in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Professor Lasch-Quinn is currently completing an appointment as a non-residential visiting faculty fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. Her first book, Black Neighbors: Race and the Limits of Reform in the American Settlement House Movement, won the annual Book Award from the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians. Also joining us for this conversation is one of our own. Paul Murphy is professor of history at Grand Valley State University. His first book, The Rebuke of History: Southern Agrarians and American Conservative Thought, won the Warren Brooks Award for Outstanding Literary Criticism and was named a Choice Outstanding Academic title. A founding member and past president of the Society for U.S. Intellectual History, Professor Murphy's current projects include a study of humanism and American thought in the first half of the 20th century, and a co-edited volume of essays on the intellectual history of the Midwest. Another local guest is JHeffery Polet, professor of political science at Hope College, where he teaches political theory. He's published in the areas of electoral law, faith-based initiatives, marriage policy, and important themes in contemporary political thought. The editor-in-chief of Front Porch Republic, he is currently at work on a project on political theology in the American context. Professor Polet is also completing a book on the Anti-Federalists. With co-editor David K. Ryden, he recently completed Church and State: Documents Decoded, forthcoming from ABC Clio. Finally, we have Father Robert Sirico, president of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, which he co-founded with Chris Allen Morin right here in Grand Rapids in 1990. His writings on religious, political, economic, and social matters have been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Review, Forbes, Financial Times, and the list goes on. He's provided commentary for CNN, ABC, the BBC, NPR, and 60 Minutes on CBS, among others. Once again, to our conversationalists and to everyone here today, thank you so much for joining us. I'll turn things over to Mark.
Thank you, Scott. So I am Mark Henrie, and like Ingrid Gregg, the first thing I need to do is explain that everything I say in my personal capacity, not in any capacity of the job that I hold at the Roop Foundation. And also, like Ingrid Gregg, I want to emphasize that part of what I see happening today is that possibly, just possibly, we've reached the stage where we can begin to think about a post-Cold War conservative thought. And that actually is a striking fact because it's been a while since there was a Cold War, but Cold War habits of mind had lingered on. And I think that's pretty much what we should be thinking about. In any event, so there was this election last year, and it was really quite something. I cannot remember anything like it. And in point of fact, my boss at the Arthur N. Roop Foundation, Arthur N. Roop, who will turn 100 next year, actually this year. He is 99 years old, has never seen anything like it in American history that he has seen. He's deeply concerned because things seem to be falling apart. And so I wanted to just tell you a little bit about, lay my cards on the table. And in the fall of 2015, we have this candidate, Donald Trump, who I dismiss as completely unserious. Who on earth would be attracted to this man? I could not explain it. And yet, he seemed to be emerging. And every time he said an outrageous thing, he emerged some more. And so around about Christmas of 2015, I took stock of our situation. And I looked and I saw the Black Lives Matter movement, where in almost every case when there was an incident, driving protest, it turned out on closer examination that the police shooting was pretty much a justified shooting, classically in Ferguson. We had the demands on college campuses, and in there, when I looked at it, I couldn't tell what the incident was that generated the demands. And yet, in each case, the universities quickly caved and gave lots of money, threw money at the problem. We had Obergefell, which from a conservative perspective was the greatest revolution in human relations in 10,000 years or more, which I had a hard time, I still have a hard time understanding the logic of it, because it seems to me that the fact that one form of sexuality never can lead to a child, and the other form of sexuality very often does, seems to me to be a distinction that makes a difference. After Obergefell, we immediately had World War T, the transgender war, with the government coming down like a ton of bricks on some poor high school in Illinois, I think it was, which wouldn't let a 14-year-old boy who thought he was a girl shower with the other girls. And we had 1 million Muslim young men of fighting age walk into Europe, and the Germans and the Swedes practically offering their daughters for rapine. And finally, we had the Trump phenomena itself. This politician unlike any we had ever seen, appealing to levels of human passion that we had never motivated in quite so shameless a way, winning. So around Christmas of 2015, I concluded that Western civilization had collapsed in 2015. And we were in an emergency situation. And so, liberated by that, I decided that I was for Trump. Sort of a Hail Mary pass. Things are falling apart. Maybe we really do need something like this. And I have to say, furthermore, that when I looked at his issues, I liked his issues. Whatever I thought of Trump the man, the pieces of the puzzle that constructed Trumpism looked rather good to me. In fact, they looked so good to me that I was struck because back in the year 1993, I wrote an article for the Intercollegiate Review. It was entitled Rethinking American Conservatism in the 1990s, The Struggle Against Homogenization. And in that article, I had said conservatism was a fusion brought about in America by a united opposition to communism. Anti-communism was the glue that held the post-war conservative movement together. We now no longer had communism in 1993, Soviet communism, as a foil. What then could be the enemy that would unite various forms of conservative faction? And I had suggested that the best choice, or the true choice that was authentic to all the traditions in one way or another, was to oppose the universal and homogeneous state, which is a term deployed by Alexander Kojève to indicate the completion of the modern liberal regime, which was a term that had been reintroduced to us by Francis Fukuyama as the end of history, that the conservative goal was to resist this end of history, the completion of the modern regime, which Kojève and Fukuyama believed was inevitable and in fact essentially complete. And if you think about it, the universal and homogeneous state is a global phenomenon. And so to oppose the universal and homogeneous state is kind of to oppose globalization or globalism. It's to assert particular identities against a kind of uniformity. It's to have bonds of solidarity that are not simply mediated by market relations or by political relations, but by cultural relations and other things of that kind. And so it struck me that, and of course, what happened in 1993 was the American conservative movement did the opposite. The American conservative movement sided with the universal and homogeneous state all the way. We would complete liberal modernity by being the vanguard party for global democracy. That was sort of the George Bush position, which was sort of inspired from Fukuyama. I had argued that we actually authentically were the opposite of that. And lo and behold, here comes Trump, saying things that seem in continuity with this more theoretical position. In any event, I'm rather less interested in Trump the man, but I am interested in this phenomenon of Trumpism, the phenomenon which is now across the West, and as we see in Europe, of something like an opposition to globalism emerging. Where I stand is I'm on that side of the anti-globalist view, and I want to devote my intellectual energies into thinking that through and to thinking it through in a conservative way. In any event, I've asked my colleagues if they might give a couple minutes reaction to my in-your-face provocative remarks, and we'll take it from there. Paul, why don't you start? And then we'll come down this way.
Yes, well, that's a good way to get us started. Those are some good provocative comments, and I hope I can be as gently and respectfully provocative in return. But in response to the Black Lives Matter issue, you know, the question, I think, for example, I think it's Philandro Castile, who was the gentleman who was shot in his car, and his partner was live streaming it. And I understand you to be saying that this will be explained away, but I think there's many cases in which it's very difficult to see that being able to be explained away. There is profound problems at some point in the process. And likewise with the issue of refugees and rape, while undoubtedly, right, much has been unleashed that is evil due to warfare, it's very difficult to characterize, I think, a whole set of people in great distress in that way. So my gentle provocation would be to say to traditionalist conservatives that that how could you support Trump? And because I'm interested in Trump the man. And my argument would be that he ought not to be president and is disqualified, and on conservative grounds, because of several factors. One, and quite serious, he's a celebrity from reality TV. And that from a traditionalist perspective about our public square, our public affairs, and our public life and civic life, that's a very dangerous, I think, thing to understand a politics that is driven by that particular kind of celebrity. Not to say a businessman celebrity. We know he's a real estate mogul, and there's some dubious elements to that. But really profoundly gaining people's attention because of his performance as a reality TV star. And a demagogue, arguably, we could disagree on that, and unprepared for the presidency, and more important, unwilling to prepare for the presidency. And he's very forthright about that in these series of highly unusual interviews that he gives and continues to give. And he's a liar. So he should not be someone respected by anyone, left or right, progressive or conservative. And we ought not to have that kind of political figure in our politics in terms of someone we invest great power, trust, and responsibility to. Now, I think the second of 3 points I'd like to make, that's the gentle provocation. The second point is, I realized that I think one of the profound differences between progressives and conservatives is this understanding of the desperation of the situation. So I see an answer to the first in what you suggested, that the times are parlous and there's no choice, and I think that's the message of the Flight 93 essay. Was it Publius Decius Mus, the now White House National Security Council communications person, who likened the nation to an aircraft heading on a suicide mission. And I guess the idea was, should we rush the cockpit on the off chance that we can prevent the mission? But I think what happened there was the plane was taken into the ground in any case, but you saved the White House. Which I guess the argument is, let's take it to the ground in the way we want. But I think the thing to I'll just observe is the profound difficulty of progressives of seeing it that way. And maybe that ties into the Make America Greater idea and the much remarked upon Michelle Obama speech, which is to the point, I don't understand what the greater America is that needs to be remade, I guess, because she sees a story of progress. And the third point I'd make is I wonder if to traditionalist conservatives, but I really see President Trump as representing a very old strand of conservative thought, an old right strand, and maybe paleo-conservative in his anti-immigrant, protectionist, and anti-interventionist kind of credo, which I think is the fundamental part of what he believes. A very old strand of thought, but I wonder if traditionalist conservatives haven't blown it. And I was struck by what Dan McCarthy said the other day, which is that, and many of the interesting comments he said, one is that now we find ourselves in the position of writing articles that we really have to lay out the policies and really kind of go into depth. But I think it might be too late for that, and not the 100 days marker. But I think President Trump and his Republican majority, he maybe has 2 years. I mean, if historical trends take place, there probably will be a weakening of his congressional. Now, if there is no legislative agenda, that's not a problem. If he's going to act as an executive to break trade agreements and things like that, and he doesn't need to. But I mean, that window, for example, that Lyndon Johnson had for a couple of years in the 60s, that's very rare in politics, and it's closing very quickly. And I think you got to be ready. So I guess I'm sort of sympathetic here. I mean, you had to have those ideas ready to go. I realize he's a problematic figure, but I wonder if you look back on it and think, and I recognize that what Dan was saying is like, this surprised us. Suddenly this person's in power. But I wonder if it isn't already being blown, that sort of opportunity, kind of from a sort of a sympathetic observer's point of view. I'll keep myself to those 3 points.
Well, I think you've been far too generous because you assume that, or at least it seemed to me, that there's some intellectual cohesion at the core of Trump. And I don't think it's that at all. I think it's simply narcissism. That's the unifying thing that's going forward. And the political phenomenon that attends that, or that responded to that, was the urgency, the desperation of the moment, and the candidate that was running against him, and the overall moral and cultural disarray in our society that we've been witnessing from well before 1993. I like to kind of pick on 1968 because I remember that year so well. I was invited to Woodstock and I declined in Brooklyn because I thought it was going to rain that weekend. I was right. So all that is to say that I do think that the China shop needed to be broken up, and now it has its bull. The question is, and I think part of the reason that it has its bull is not because people have really gathered around an idea. I mean, this man in this moment is really, the critique that he's a reality television star is very similar to the critique of Reagan having been a B-list actor. In that day, that's exactly what was said. Today, the reality TV star is more or less the cultural equivalent of that. The difference in the men is that one had a set of ideas to which he was attached and the other doesn't. But I think what coalesced around him was this desperation, and also that the kind of cherry-picking issues that resonated with people, whether it's the immigration issue or this economic autarky that Trump is fond of putting forth, this notion that, you know, we can all do it, America can do it all by ourselves, which is a complete repudiation of any kind of semblance of free market understanding of the division of labor. But that these various factions responded not to the whole of that agenda, there being none really, other than him, but what they particularly felt strongest about. So that if somebody felt strongest about immigration, they responded to that. And how any traditional conservative, especially one who cites the recent Supreme Court ruling on marriage, could affiliate or identify with Trump. Trump has placed the gay agenda at the heart of this modern conservative movement, whatever is happening, whatever you want to call it. I don't like to call it a conservative movement. I think the alternative to that is a call for a new fusionism, which is rooted in the permanent things, which is the only thing that's going to give us solace. And what the advantage of the permanent things is that it gives us a broader perspective, because, and I'll make a prophecy here, maybe equivalent to the prophecy about it raining at Woodstock, and that is that President Trump won't finish his term of office. I'm not saying that he's going to be assassinated or anything. I don't know anything about any of that. I just have a hunch that Melania is going to get tired of living in public housing. and he's going to get bored with the tasks of what are required. And it kind of crimps a personality that side. Now imagine if that happens in a year or two, what this discussion would look like, because there are in place now, thanks to a set of advisors, some appointments, including a vice president who wouldn't have been my first choice for president, but is not so bad. That could bring things back into focus. But what's needed is this combination of freedom and virtue, which is why I raised the subject of a new fusionism, but a new fusionism that doesn't have to fight every battle as though it were the last battle. The two figures that inspire me, roughly separated by a century and yet very similar in a lot of ways, especially intellectually, are Blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman and Avery Cardinal Dulles. And I point to them not because they're Catholics or cardinals, but because of the synthetical nature of their minds that resulted from their being able to ponder the permanent things, not to overuse that term, to ponder certain truths, but not to confuse those truths or the mode in which, the vocabulary in which that they are articulated with the truths themselves. And that in turn enabled them to be open to and listen to and understand the idiom of the moment. And I think what we need to do is to be able to hold to those truths and then have a conversation that re-articulates those ancient truths in a modern context. Part of that is going to involve taking account of the technology, obviously, which many have done. I think also not the cultural and PC trends, but the truths that those trends are trying to articulate. The Black Lives Matters thing is one of those. There's a core truth here, that at the founding of the United States, we had a scar at our founding, which was called slavery. And we're not completely healed from that yet. And from the slavery as an institution, but the mentality of it and the way in certain cases our police forces or our culture responds to minority groups, to brown people, I think is part of it. I think also the whole question of the homosexual movement, which I think is dead wrong in its theology, but is right in the alienation that people feel unnecessarily. We have to recognize that some people have an orientation that they did not ask for, and there's no sense in alienating those people from the very truth that can give them a sense of meaning in life. And I think we see this begin to percolate up in now the breakout of gay conservatives. Now, I think there's a problem with all of that, but I think we need to engage it with that synthetical approach that Dulles or Newman would have approached and said, what's the truth here? What can we pull out, and how can we re-articulate these truths in a way that makes sense to people? Because I think a lot of the conversation, I mean, in one or two generations, we've gone from the eloquence of a public debate represented by Firing Line and Bill Buckley to the regular food fights you see on Sean Hannity. And I think that tells us something is terribly wrong with our ability to engage in reasoned debate and kind of achieve some clarity about where we need to go from here.
Well, I find myself somewhere between Mark and Paul. So I'll try to approach it this way, and I'll use Alexis de Tocqueville as my guide before Gary does. That's why I'm really glad we started at that end. We have spent the last 50 years coarsening the culture, becoming more crude, more vulgar, treating vulgarity as if it is a fundamental constitutional right that people possess, experiencing higher levels of personal narcissism, and creating this kind of cult of celebrity that has nothing to do with people's intrinsic merits. I'm not surprised that we end up with Donald Trump. I mean, that's pretty much, if I stood outside this culture and looked at it, what I would expect a president to look like. I don't like it because I think the culture is in disarray, and this is clearly a person who's not going to fix this culture. So how have we gotten to this moment? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that democracy does not have a good track record as a system of government. In the ancient world, when Plato talks about democracy, he talks about it as the pretty much the worst form of government that you can have, because it unleashes personal licentiousness in the complete collapse of social authority, which again I think is an important part of our cultural moment, is the collapse of authority, and will be followed, as sure as night follows day, by tyranny. And so it seems to me there's kind of a long story at work here about the fate of democracy itself. At the beginning of democracy in America, Tocqueville says, if you look at the history of the world in the last 700 years, everything has worked toward the advancement of equality. Even the things that resist equality work toward the advancement of equality. And he contemplates this as, on the one hand, a providential fact, he says. And then on the other hand, when he thinks about it, he says, it fills my soul with a kind of religious terror. Because he thinks it's going to unleash something that human beings will not be able to control. And so he says at one point later in the introduction, you can't hope to stop democracy and all the chaos it's going to unleash upon the world, but perhaps you can hope to tame it. And so part of what democracy in America is trying to do is to figure out the mechanisms by which democracy can be tamed. And when he looks at American democracy, he says, well, it's you know, what Mark Twain once said about Wagner's music, it's better than it sounds. He's, you know, sort of what Tocqueville says about democracy, you know, it's better than its, or what Brownson says about democracy, right? It's better than its theory. I lost my train of thought there. By trying to be clever, I lost my train of thought. Yeah. What has happened? Part of, I think, what happens in modern democracy is that it's always going to reflect, and this is Plato's point, it's always going to reflect what human beings are or what we understand human beings to be. If you look at the American founding, especially the Federalists, the predominant understanding of what human beings are is that they're kind of rational calculators of interest. And you can create political institutions that help them be rational calculators of self-interest and that channel those things into positive directions or supposedly positive directions and can place through institutional arrangements the kind of barriers that you need to keep self-interest from running out of control, running amok. And that's a view that holds for a while, probably at least until Lincoln, who rejects the view. I'm happy to say negative things about Lincoln. And then when the progressives come along, there's a different view. It's a view on the one hand about human perfectibility, and a view on the other hand that politics is and ought to be administered by a group of scientific elites, social scientific elites. And that view holds for a while until we get to the 1980s. So if, I can talk about the PC wars in the 1980s. In part what happens is what Paul Ricoeur refers to as the hermeneutics of suspicion is unleashed. And this whole idea of human rationality that did undergird both the founders' views and the progressives' views is undone by these ideas of the fundamental irrationality of human beings, driven either by an interest in power, like Nietzsche, an interest in class, like Marx, or an interest in kind of deep sexuality, like Freud. So we now think about human beings as irrational creatures. So the other part of Fukuyama's title is The End of History and the Last Man. And this is, I think we've kind of entered in the post-Cold War world into a sort of Nietzschean world, where the world gets divided when you have this sort of transvaluation of all values that has taken place, this negation of value that has taken place. The world is divided into those who master power and rule the world, and those who seek security and seek comfort and seek material well-being. And right, that's the last man, according to Nietzsche. And here I think Tocqueville is a useful guide alongside Nietzsche, because one of the things Tocqueville complains about democratic society is that it atomizes human beings. We become so interested in material, because we're anxious. Right? By our nature, in mass society, we become anxious, we become uncertain about ourselves, we become convinced that we're replaceable. We become convinced that there's really nothing distinct or unique or important about us. We're cogs in this massive machine. And so this anxiety becomes, Tocqueville says, incredibly creative in democratic societies, but also incredibly destructive. And there are certain things that kind of might keep it in control, but in the end, what you will have, Tocqueville says, is this, and Brad Berzer talked about this in that quotation he gave from The End of Democracy in America, where you get increased atomization on the one hand, and you get increased, what do you call it, the sort of soft despotism of democracy on the other hand, the kind of nanny state, or however you want to call it. Now, take that same problem and do that on a global scale. Right, where I teach at a college where we're doing something no other college in the country is doing, and that is we are forming global citizens. Right? It's a unique idea. Nobody would think about doing that. One of the things that I discover with my students is they feel isolated and alienated from American politics. They're certainly going to feel isolated and alienated on a global stage. And that isolation, alienation, that sense of inconsequentiality, that sense of replaceability and unimportance is going to manifest itself in very destructive ways. And on the one hand, it will do exactly what Tocqueville says and what Nietzsche says, this kind of collapse in the last man, the seek for comfort, for well-being, perhaps psychic well-being, right, the quest for authenticity that's going on college campuses and so forth. And on the other hand, might manifest itself in kind of atavistic backlashes. And I think that's sort of what Trumpism, if there is such a thing as Trumpism, sort of is. It's a kind of atavistic backlash. You know, it appeals to a kind of tribalism in a global age. So from my point of view, the problem of tribalism is, in a sense, a problem. But the bigger problem is globalism. And I'm not sure, this is where I'm sort of with Tocqueville, right? That you look at the history of the world over the last while. I mean, Mark mentioned, you know, people have known about this for a while. And nothing seems to stop it. That's what Tocqueville's talking about, democracy. Nothing is stopping it. Like all the attempts to tame it and to slow it down just exacerbate it. And I think globalism and globalization is the problem. I don't know how to stop it. I don't think Trump is going to stop it. And I think that he is a crude and narcissistic atavism that no conservative should have signed themselves up to.
Well, this is why you shouldn't have Jeff and me on the same panel, because we want to talk about Tocqueville, or ask either of us about craft beer, because we'll talk too long about that too, particularly when we're in Grand Rapids. Thank you, Glebes Whitney and Scott and all in Hauenstein Center for this weekend, inviting me to be part of this. And like Mark, I also need to distance myself from my own institutions and and anybody that I'm associated with. And I find myself, like Jeff, right between Paul and Mark on this. The question, I think, of is in the panel topic was something to the effect of conservative thought in an age of Trump. And I want to keep my remarks, sort of narrow it to that. And my short answer is conservative thought. That's not going to be my complete answer, but my short answer is we shouldn't be thinking about Trump, particularly Paul's Trump. Paul's Trump, the man, should not be considered when we're thinking about what is a conservative. What does it mean to have a conservative country? Because he's nothing like a conservative. He is not one. I also agree with Jeff's very poignant points, as this is, I think, the man that we probably should predict in a culture that we have. On the other hand, Mark's opening remarks were about not Trump the man, but Trump a wider series of concerns that are out there that should be part of what conservatives are thinking about. About a year ago, and it was almost exactly a year ago, by the way, don't forget the Kentucky Derby goes off soon, so I need to wrap this up. I'm from Kentucky, if you didn't know that, pick that up. About exactly a year ago, around Derby week, I was wrestling with this phenomena that I saw coming. I did not think he would be president, but I thought it was a possibility. And certainly by then that he would probably be the Republican nominee. And so I wrestled with what should be the Republican Party's association with Donald Trump be, should he win the nomination, which he was going to do, and then, by some crazy miracle, also win the presidency, or miracle, or whatever you want to put it, the opposite of that. Win the presidency. How should the Republican Party react? So I wrote a piece, as I thought about it, and I think it was published in The Hill, the newspaper Capitol Hill, where I argued that it was time to get back to the founders' vision of the presidency, and that we should create and consider Trump to be a president without a party. That he was not truly a Republican by any stretch of the imagination. I know you Democrats in the room don't want to claim him either. He is certainly not a conservative Republican. And so he should be treated as I think the founders intended our presidents to be treated. And that is outside of party. I mean, George Washington warned us about party in this farewell address and the creation of parties. And when he had good ideas that should be supported, then the Republicans should support them. And when he had bad ideas, they should distance themselves from him. Obviously, that's not happening. This to a degree, potentially, possibly. And that's a danger maybe we can talk about. But I think the same thing is true for the conservative movement or the conservative thought leaders and those thinking about, on all sides, of what kind of culture we want, what kind of country that we want. And that is, we should not be wrestling too terribly with Donald Trump at all, or anything he says or tweets at all. We should be looking at the deeper forces that Mark brought up in particular in the beginning and considering what impact they may have on conservatism or any kind of thought about the culture. Father Sirico gave me a great metaphor, I think, and I have an even better one I want to give because I've been thinking about it for the last 24 hours. But I talked about a bull in a china shop, which was a nice metaphor. The bull came in, broke up the china shop. You don't let the bull rebuild the china shop, right? You get them out the door, and then more sane, more thoughtful people come along and help rebuild. And the culture is right. I mean, a whole cultural movement needs to be to rebuild that china shop. And a lot of things, I think that's sort of what's happened and what we should keep in mind. The metaphor that I actually thought about yesterday when I was thinking about what to say about this was actually more of a health metaphor, and a metaphor dealing with viruses and antibodies. So it seems to me that if you think about the election, there was a constitutional majority in this country that in the Electoral College, there was a constitutional majority of people that seemed to see, and or be able to articulate it like Mark did probably, but felt something is sick. Something is wrong in this culture. Something is wrong in the country. Something is wrong about America. Something is wrong about the globalization and all the other ailments that we know of. And so that constitutional majority, I want to liken to antibodies, white blood cells, what have you, that were fighting back against something they saw out there, or a whole series of things, complicated issues, that were undermining the American constitutional order, the American political order, the American culture. And they had a weapon at their, a more powerful weapon at their disposal, and that is an antibiotic named Donald Trump. And what's important to think about him as the antibiotic is the same way as the bull in the china shop. He's going to come in and he's going to wreak havoc on that virus. But we should not, and I think it's very important that we think about this, we should not equate being on a drug, being on an antibiotic, with health. Maybe those folks, the constitutional majority out there, thought that strong medicine was necessary for the moment, but that doesn't mean we stay on that medicine for very long. And so if you think about it that way, I think where we are right now is we're in a moment where there's sort of been a reset in American politics. There was a very clear trend line. I think if you're wondering why all the snowflakes on college campuses, and I teach on a college campus, I'll tell you I stayed away from college for 3 days because the tears were something I didn't want to deal with. I'm weak in that way, I guess, whatever. I'm too caring, so the crying would be. But really, the tears, the yelling, that was going on college campus, it was pretty incredible. And when I did get back there 3 or 4 days later, it was still going on. But I think the reason is because we have been through a climb where everything seemed to be going, let's say call it the millennial direction. Everything seemed to be going that way with Obergefell and with all the other cultural movements and marijuana and all that kind of stuff legalized. It was all going that direction, and then all of a sudden it was like, crap. Well, crap. The progressive thing just sort of broke for a moment. And I think that's where we are, is that line that Tocqueville predicts that, okay, I'm going to bring up Tocqueville anyway, sorry. That actually the line of history is progressive in the sense that it's going to go, its marches in one direction, and that is towards centralization of power in And the only way that changes is through, we call this a work of art. It's natural that's going to happen. A work of art will give us, potentially save individual independence and local liberties, as he calls them. So I think this is that sort of a moment. We don't have to like the man. We don't have to like lots of what we didn't have to agree on it. But it's a moment to rethink now what it means to be a conservative, what it means to be a progressive, what it means to be a liberal, what it means to be an American. And I think that's where we are. And forget Trump the man. Try to move beyond that. Think about what moved the people to vote for him and vote against him. And as you know, as part of one culture here, let's use this moment to rethink.
Gary, I have a better metaphor than antibiotics. Chemotherapy, which takes a big toll.
Yeah, good point.
I can sometimes be overly literal, but I will point out to my last three panelists that all four of us are actually in between Paul and Mark.
I was just talking about myself.
Abraham Lincoln spoke of the better angels of our nature. The incivility, the inequality, the not just racism, but race hatred, not just sexism, but misogyny, the extremism and the extreme, I would say, destructionism that we're witnessing, that has trumped the moment. One very distinguished professor of atmospheric science said, "This is the moment when nightmare becomes reality." I agree, though, with some of my panelists that this nightmare is longer in the making. And I would like to refer to three things very briefly here. One is something I think we do not need for our current moment of this nightmarish moment. One thing is what I think we do need. And then finally, I would like to have a brief statement on what I think we have here in this room. So first of all, what do we not need? In movie after movie today, and I'll briefly refer to The Matrix because many people have seen that, but there are many other movies like that. We see recurring themes of bleakness, alienation, and suffocation. These are ubiquitous in the popular culture today, and not just thanks to movies like The Matrix, dystopian movies like that. Our imaginative world, from its alternate reality games to its fixation on worst-case scenarios, reflects an embodiment crisis, a crisis on what it means to be embodied human beings, that has been exacerbated by new technologies and their seductions. In movies, this translates into an apocalypse that is forever just about to arrive, except when it has not already occurred. And I'm sorry for reading a little bit of what I've prepared, but time is running out quickly here. The apocalyptic genre is not any longer a genre. It's a way of life. It's what we're facing. Doom, destruction, and desolation have become hook, line, and sinker across whole seas of artistic and political expression. The end of the world genre yields new genres now, breaks out of old genres, remakes old genres and new ones alike, and ends up by forcing us to question genre itself, and I think even life itself. Futuristic themes and landscapes, whether utopian or dystopian, are so prevalent now that it is difficult to separate out a thread of Gnosticism, which I distinguish from narcissism because that's related to me because my father wrote a book about narcissism. I think it's a moment of narcissism for sure, but we've been in that moment a long time. But also Gnosticism. Gnostic imagery is Manichaeanism. Us versus them. Strict world versus other world. The world here in a Gnostic view is inherently evil. It's the product, this real world, him, us, this is all evil, this real world, this material world, this embodied world, in the Gnostic point of view. And many social critics have pointed out, people like Eric Voegelin and others, that this is the worldview of modern life, a contempt for the real world. So in our Gnosticism, like ancient Gnosticism and postmodern Gnosticism, the world is sheer illusion, the evil product of a false divinity. So that's what I think we do not need and what we have had for some time now. What do we need? I'll just quote briefly from a poem by Wendell Berry, who really can't be pigeonholed as progressive or conservative, and I suspect many in this room cannot either. And he says this. It's a poem that's a critique of our world, but also one that is full of hope, that proposes a different way of thinking. Say that your main crop is the forest that you did not plant, that you will not live to harvest. So I'll just repeat. Say that your main crop, that's what you're producing, is the forest that you did not plant, that you will not live to harvest. Say that the leaves are harvested when they have rotted into the mold. Call that profit. That's profit, when you let the leaves rot into the mold. That's where everything is generated from, the topsoil. And I would say that's one of the things that we have in this room, topsoil. During the American century and into our own day, Wendell Berry's work, and indeed the way he decided to live his life, has emerged as one of the most serious and sustained critiques of modern living and its costs, including Gnosticism and that dark view that I gave you. In 2012, at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at UVA, he summarized the viewpoint that he has been trying to get across his whole long life in essays, poems, works of social criticism, novels, all kinds of talks, etc. And he said this: we need a new respect for propriety of scale and the law of return, both of which are essential, and they are closely related. Sir Albert Howard understood what he called the law of return as one of nature's fundamental laws. It requires that whatever nutrients and organic materials are taken from the land must be returned. This probably is the fundamental law of sustainability, and it depends on getting the scale right, which usually means a fairly small scale. And I think that phrase, a new respect for propriety of scale and the law of return, has incredible force across the entire political spectrum. It could be the basis of a new sensibility, a fusionist point of view, that is more important than partisan divisions, and is absolutely crucial in this nightmare that we're in. So that is what I think we don't need, more of the dark and hopeless nihilism and Gnosticism and narcissism that has been having a long heyday. And I think what we do need is something like a return of humility and small scale and a sense of propriety, proportion, and those kinds of things. But then what do we have? Well, we're coming at the end of a very long conference, and I've been listening very closely to many, many, many papers and ideas, and it's just been a wonderful conference. And I wanted to thank Gleaves and Scott for the honor of having me here, and for all of you who organized this and everyone who's here. It's an incredibly moving event. And I would just like to say, in all that listening, I started a list because I really take very seriously the idea of common ground. I don't think we're going to move anywhere from this nightmare ever, and it's always been this way with human history, which is one long set of crises and emergencies, unless we have common ground and we find that common ground. So I started a list of things I heard people saying, and I noticed if anyone else seemed to be agreeing, and there seems to be so much to agree on. So maybe you will disagree and say that these elements are not things that we all share here, but this is what I have so far. Finding a common ground. Conserve, that's the small c conservative position, a traditionalist conservative position. But conserving is very much a left-wing, quote, progressive view as well, in the environmentalist realm. So you can be anywhere on the political spectrum, and if you are dedicated to conserving this physical world that we live in, the embodied experience that we have, that is something that we all have in common, not a contempt for the world around us, but a feeling that it must be conserved. Certainly we can start there and build to other things that we value for conserving. So this love of the world. Another one is to hear people talk about the beauty around us, a feeling that the universe is a beautiful place, that it has a capacity to awe us and fill us with wonder. Community, a sense of community, that other people are important to us, vital to us. Civility, that it matters how we talk to one another and whether we actually listen to one another. Humanism. Do we think that the human person is worth valuing and creating a healthy environment for so that people's own lives can be sustained? The dignity of human life itself. The dehumanization of some technologies. And the feeling of rejection of pressures to conform. That also seems like something many have said. A position against nihilism. Critique of atomistic individualism gone awry, or narcissism. A communitarian sensibility. A strong sense of place. Civic mindedness. Anti-instrumentalism, that people shouldn't use other people. The sense that small is beautiful. And I guess last but not least, that life can be best understood not as a cost-benefit analysis, but as something in its own right. So that's all I have. I just wanted to thank you because I think there is a lot of common ground here.
So we're almost out of time. One thing that I would say, well, I guess I would ask it as a question first. For my part, I think that the way the conservative intellectuals should respond to Trump is to see what has been revealed in the phenomenon about where we actually stand as a society, and then try to generate thoughts and conceptualizations that would relieve the burn that's causing this. And so for my part, I've joined the board of American Affairs Journal, which is a new journal that Dan McCarthy mentioned yesterday, which is an attempt to make sense of Trumpism, understood as strong border security, economic nationalism, and a America First foreign policy, or a non-interventionist foreign policy, and sort of build up arguments and reflections around that, which seems to me which by the way seems to me to be very necessary, and various parts of the conservative intellectual movement should be attracted to this. The difficulty is the revulsion at Trump the man is so great that people just want to sort of sit on their hands. And I think that that's a shirking of responsibility at a time when there does need to be some account which explains this phenomenon. Because as I say, it is bigger than the United States. It's bigger than this reality TV star. It's happening in Europe, everywhere in Europe, that there is a problem which up until last year, we simply pretended away, pretended everything would work out in the end. It's sort of this faith that it all works out in the end while people were hurting, and hurting badly. Jeff?
Yeah, along those lines, common ground, to go off what Elisabeth said, is a concrete thing, right? I mean, you're actually occupying ground with each other, space with each other. And I think one of the problems that we run into, maybe it's an occupational hazard for some of us, is that we're not around people who supported Trump. And one of the reasons why political scientists were so surprised by the outcome is because none of them had actually spent time with people who were going to vote for Trump. And if you do, and I do for a variety of reasons, because I don't like hanging around academics that much mostly. But I didn't meet one of them. I mean, of all the people I met who were going to vote for Trump, I did not meet one who liked him. I did not meet one who thought he would be a good president. I did not meet one who thought he was an honorable human being. Every one of them just had this sense that there's something that has gone very wrong with the world. And yeah, he was the bull who was going to go break up the China shop. And that's what needed to happen, because whatever else was going on at the sort of level of crony capitalism that was running this country, it was not resonating in their lives at all. And like I said, I don't think this is going to fix it. You know, in part, I don't think it's going to fix it because neither candidate addressed the one thing you would have to address to fix it, which is our serious budget problems in this country. Right? I mean, this whole movement of globalization is being funded with cheap credit and massive debt and unsustainable liabilities. You know, and neither candidate addressed that. So I just think that part of that common ground is, you know, to get out there and you know, spend time, not talk to them, but to spend time with people that just have a different experience of life than what we do.
Scott, do we have time for questions?
About 10 minutes.
We have 10 minutes. Please ask questions.
Sorry. No, it's okay. I'm not.
I think that's what.
Thank you.
Yes, sure.
I think for the last 2 days, I've been trying to think hard about what it requires of us to come to a room like this and spend 2 days in conversation. And for me, your opening remarks in this panel really broke the frame. And so on the one hand, I feel like I need to stand up and say, I don't know, Black Lives Matter, immigration is a human rights crisis. I stand with my gay and lesbian brothers and sisters in their quest for dignity. So I guess we could all stand up and make those kinds of claims, but I wonder how you all think about something that I talk to my students who are not snowflakes at all about, which is we come to a law classroom to talk about doctrine, to talk about policy, to talk about issues, to talk about hard-edged approaches to thinking about the world. And at the same time, we have to manage to be cognizant that there are people in the room for whom the issues we talk about are also their lives. So perhaps that's a question for conservative thought, which is how conservative thought thinks about that. I heard sport today, and I reject the view that we take on these kinds of conversations in the spirit of sport and mixing it up. I used to be a lawyer. I used to do that well. But I came to these kinds of rooms because I thought there was more to the ethic of conversation in sport, or winning and losing, So I'm wondering what kind of ethical, interpersonal framework you all bring to this conversation, and how conservative thought contributes to our capacity to have these conversations. Thanks.
I can respond to that. I try to be very honest, and I'm honest about everything that I said. And the world will continue to move in your direction, but it does not seem, well, it's a mixed bag. Sometimes I think that the evidentiary basis is not there. Sometimes I think that I still haven't been convinced. I'm sorry, but I haven't been rationally convinced that.
It would be great if you responded to my question rather than
About
reiterating what you already talked about.
The amounts of civility?
What is your ethical position about how we sustain a common ground conversation given the differences that are apparent between us?
I think we try to be honest and tough. Because essentially what you would offer is that I shouldn't be honest about how I think.
Could I
Sure, go ahead.
I don't think we should just be honest and tough. I think we need to be ruthless with ideas. And I think a great deal of the problem of the inability to have a conversation is the loss of a common grammar. And if emotivism or sentimentalism or just a basic sense of I feel trumps, pardon the word, trumps a common belief that the mind is capable of apprehending truth, not to say the whole of the truth, but that we can look at things and on the basis of reason have clashes, have disagreements. I think we're losing that. Maybe not in this room, maybe not among these people, this people, but I think as I look at the culture as a whole, there is a great deal of that. So I say we have to be ruthless with ideas, but we have to be infallibly, and here I say my own mea culpa, gentle with people and respectful of people. Because if there's a common ground, certainly other than rationality, it is human dignity. And we have to recognize that even in those whose ideas we disagree with. And I think there's too little of that across the board. And so that combination of ruthless with ideas and gentle and respectful of people can go a long way in promoting a kind of, I don't want to call it a common ground, but at least a common conversation, which I long for among people who don't agree with my rather conservative traditional ideas. But I'm prepared to have that conversation respectfully if we can agree to do it rationally.
So one of the questions we had coming in is thinkers who could contribute to our current conversation had lots. For example, to a conservatism formed on national greatness claims, I thought the person is Reinhold Niebuhr or anyone else who talks about humility, which maybe connects a little bit to what you were saying. But the absolute essential thinker, from my perspective, is Jane Addams, who found her middle-class Anglo-American white experience to necessarily be translated into a diverse and immigrant neighborhood in Chicago, an established Hull House. And she set herself up as the interpreter between peoples. At a time of great national discord that probably exceeds our national discord of today by far. And it was a very brave act, and she consistently pursued that mediating role. And that effort, I think, in a very profound way to create common ground throughout her career. But she saw it as essentially, in her progressive view, of the essential act of democracy. And she was not a socialist, but she had an idea of what democracy required. And she used to talk about it as social democracy, as about bringing people together. And one part of that was that there had to be people who could move between the different camps and speak and write to the different people who are involved in it. And I think that everyone should read Jane Addams, and I think we need people like Jane Addams to facilitate what everybody, I think, wants, but everybody finds very difficult, which is to have those honest, frank, hard discussions that I think are required, but are incredibly difficult to have at this moment in our national history.
Just a quick comment on that. There's no conversation without risk. So any people who are genuinely engaged in dialogue, which means they want to find the common logos through all individual and idiosyncratic logoi, is that they have to be willing to risk those ideas in conversation. And so the challenge for all of us, I think, is to ask ourselves, what beliefs do we have, what ideas do we have that we are willing to risk, that we are willing to say, yeah, maybe I'm wrong about this. And that's why it's difficult, is because you're dealing sometimes with beliefs that aren't that consequential and you can easily throw them out there, but other times we're dealing with ideas and beliefs that cut to the core of who we are and what we believe. And under those circumstances, we are risking a great deal in conversation. And so one of our reactions will be not to engage in it because the costs might be too high.
I wanted to add something to this, I really like that question about what your ethical framework is. Last night we had a wonderful panel where we had some of the younger journalists who are really an interesting and wonderful force, speaking with really some of the thoughtful, slightly older, not a different generation at all, journalists. And it was a highly productive conversation for me to listen to, and I agree with almost everything on both sides. I didn't see that there were sides, which is often the case for me. At one point, though, there was tension. It was clear people on stage disagreed with one another. And it was Sarah Leonard and Bhaskar Sankara and David Marcus, and they were speaking with Winston Elliott, who was really giving a very compelling position to me on beauty and aesthetics and love and affection. And it was kind of tense for a moment. And then David Marcus spoke up, one of the younger journalists, and found a point of agreement. And the point of agreement that he was willing to concede, that many people on the left would not have, but he did, was a point that Winston Elliott was really wanting to get across, which was that there are some things that are not to be politicized, that there's another part of life, a huge part of life, that isn't to be subjected in the same way that we might a political issue. And I think there's so much agreement between small C conservatives of some kinds, depending on those ideas that they're holding, and some people who have been dynamos behind some of the major 20th century social movements that really progressives claim to be all about. And people like Martin Luther King Jr. He was preaching a gospel of love, like Mahatma Gandhi. People who wrote the Port Huron Statement. Todd Gitlin, still with us, still writing and engaging. He's also very difficult to pigeonhole politically. And it's about love. That's what it comes down to, is love, the beloved community, that we are living in a community of fellow human persons. And so I would go further than saying only that we treat people gently. That's a must, but that we treat people lovingly. And that's outside of politics. That should be the baseline of even why we live together socially and not just off by ourselves.
Jason Duncan, Aquinas College. I study political history, and culture is obviously driving a lot of this. But in looking back at the political parties, you know, there's never a golden age of politics, really. But at some point in the 20th century, you had Republicans, or excuse me, you had liberals and conservatives in both parties, and they had to find common ground within their party, which wasn't always easy, and then take it to the other party. And sometimes that worked, like the Republicans supporting the Civil Rights Act, for example. And now we don't have that. We have a conservative party and a liberal party, and the common ground is extremely hard to find. So I wonder, I mean, this is hardly the last word for this great conference, but I wonder if you think like a common ground party, millions of us don't identify as Professor Lasch-Quinn said, don't identify as conservative or progressive. I just wondered if, given our sort of two-party history and the structure of the Constitution, you think there's any hope for a party that's not wedded to one of these two that we have currently. Thanks.
If we could answer briefly, please, because there are two people. Dan, you're next, and then this will be the last question. So if we can just
do we have a single sentence political science answer?
Not a single sentence, but close. Something to think about. One of the concerns, I think, is you're absolutely right. This is a serious problem. If you look at the exit polls from the elections, you'll see this very clearly. We have now sorted, where we used to have diversity in the parties, we have now sorted along cultural lines. So the fact is, you likely live in an area where you voted like everybody else in your community. You live like everybody else, you go to the same churches, or you don't go to a church at all. And that we've sorted out in that way. So I am seriously worried about how we have a conversation and a real find common ground if actually the fact is married people vote differently than single people. Black people vote differently than white people. Women vote differently than men to some degree, but marriage knocks most of that out, frankly. Rural people vote differently than urban people. I think that's a serious problem I think we need to wrestle with. We need to figure out how to talk to people that aren't like us culturally.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly bring up something that Father Sirico had mentioned. I've written about a concept called virtue libertarianism, which is something that my friend William Ruger, who's at the Charles Koch Institute, and Jason Sorens, who's at Mark Henry's alma mater, Dartmouth, have both been promulgating. And it's essentially an attempt at creating a new fusionism, or a libertarianism that is open to religious conservatives, but is not necessarily fighting a hard line on some of the culture war issues and so forth. It's still conservative, traditionalist, but is, trying to work within a libertarian framework. I wanted to very quickly ask Father Sirico about his thought of a fusionism that would be an alternative perhaps to this nationalist direction that conservatism might take, and maybe also ask Mark Henrie very quickly whether, why he would see perhaps a right-wing populism or nationalism as being more, having a greater future perhaps than this idea of a return to a fusionist libertarian conservatism.
Yeah, I'll try to be very brief. That's a great question and worthy of a whole conference all by itself. That's really what I'm calling for. I think there are going to be a few things that are going to be non-negotiable and that we're going to have to part ways on. Life issues, in my mind. If you believe in any government, then I think life needs to be protected. But I think a lot of the other cultural issues, by virtue of a, I don't know, you call it, I saw in one note, a localism. I would call it subsidiarity. That is where needs are first met at the most local level. There's a lot of potential for a common ground in that way of thinking, and to think of it radically, to think of it seriously. Within a framework of law, my Reform friends would call that more sphere sovereignty, but we can massage that. But driving things to the most local level of their existence without neglecting a whole, and not neglecting that at times higher levels of social organization have to have some part, but not normatively. So I would see, I think the marriage issue could have been handled a lot differently than it was handled, and I tried to get people to think about that, but it wasn't. I think that I frankly do not understand the gender issue. From a rational point of view, I'm still looking for a rational argument that gets me at least thinking about it. I think we can handle a lot of the homosexual issues by recognizing people's rights, as long as people recognize that reciprocally and mutually. So I would call for that, and what, to my mind, binds that is a vigorous traditional understanding of the human person, of life, but a limitation of government in a serious way. So I'd be open to that kind of discussion.
My answer to Dan's part of the question directed to me is that we lost the culture war with respect to the sexual issues. It's over, there's nothing to be done. And so that's not even an issue. I think we can continue writing about empirical evidence when it emerges of various forms of relationship. We can do some sort of social critique, but there is no political dimension to the sexual culture war issues anymore. And that's something that I think is probably true. That's then the nationalism or the American greatness dimension is I think that what has been revealed in the last several years is that all along multiculturalism was confecting conditions in which there is no common good. It's basically creating the conditions of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where the Hungarians can only feel okay if they're putting somebody else down or whatever. And so it occurs to me that the identity politics that arose out of that is very destructive, and the sort of Hail Mary pass is that having a primary identity as an American may help us to have something to hold together with. And so that's part of what drives that.
Last question.
Throughout all the presentations, this one especially, I think, over the last couple of days, I've revisited a number of dialogues and debates I've had with myself in my head and my heart. Just to give a couple of examples, as a liberal, I firmly believe that people should be allowed to do their own things so long as it doesn't actually harm others. At the same time, as a social scientist, I recognize that rampant individualism is indeed the path to narcissism, a very toxic form of narcissism. As a liberal, I believe that it is useful and even essential to constantly question norms and traditions and authorities. But as a social scientist, I recognize that as a society without any universal norms and shared traditions and respectable authorities is probably not going to last very long. As a liberal, I really do believe that people shouldn't be hated upon and othered if they fail in terms of their personal lives in one or more ways. At the same time, I recognize that personal responsibility really is beneficial to all of society, not just at the individual level, but at the collective level, and that one of the most effective ways of doing that is to have some degree of stigma associated with failings when it comes to personal responsibility, rather than normalizing them or even celebrating them. And I'm wondering, do you folks think that maybe the proper response is to try to find the right balance, rather than simply have people with very opposing views try to just communicate but never reach any consensus?
I think you are common ground, so discovered.
I think the model for that is Christ's encounter with the woman caught in the act of adultery. It's very often misunderstood, I think, that encounter as him just downplaying the adultery. That's not what he does, because the last thing he says is sin no more. But what he does is protect her dignity, because she's a human being. He doesn't justify the sin. And that surprised people. There must have been something about Christ's general posture that made them think he was going to say, oh, it doesn't matter. It mattered to him, but she mattered to him. And so I think if we can find a hermeneutic of continuity rather than this hermeneutic of suspicion and division, we'd be in a better place to have these conversations and have our disagreements.
Can I say something about that too? I know you want to get going. So I think moderating differences like that and this kind of reasonable a view is important. But I want to say something about fusionism. And what I'd like to say about fusionism is this is an imperative from the conservative movement of the 50s and 60s, especially associated with William F. Buckley. But I think the true fusionist
Frank Meyer.
And Frank Meyer, or perhaps the original sort of new conservatives like Russell Kirk and Viereck and some other folks like that. Because I think what happened with fusionism is that a big component of an earlier right, which was a strident anti-capitalism, dropped out. And that much is what is missing from conservative thought is that willingness to do that other thing, which is to sort of seek some common ground on capitalism, instead of having an excessive commitment to free market economics, which I think exaggerates all the problems of individualism and a kind of free agent nation we've created, which facilitates some of these cultural problems which conservatives love to complain about. I mean, Buckley stole the conservative label in a way and attached it to a kind of economic libertarianism, free market economics, and attached a traditionalism which was only the assertion of moral principles and moral absolutes. But if you go back to, for example, the Southern agrarians, what they said was that the economic conviction is the secular image of religion, right? That you can't just pour in soft materials culturally on top, that you had to look at the economic base of society and start there to have a healthy culture. And I think that the fusionism was never a true fusionism, and that those people who are really seeking a sort of mixing of important ideas that would unite left and right preceded the conservative movement. But of course, that's a big discussion. I know that might not be.
Let's give this panel a hand. You know, you all have hung in there. I'm going to be very brief, but what I want to say is very important. First of all, it's gratitude, gratitude, gratitude. It's gratitude for the speakers who have come here. I challenged us on our first night. Bring your A game. Bring your courage. Bring your imagination. Bring your skill as human beings relating to other human beings. We talked about Ralph Hauenstein, a man with more emotional intelligence. A couple of you on this stage knew Ralph well. A man with more emotional intelligence than just about anybody I've ever known. And the emotional intelligence with which you have dealt with these difficult issues is something that I've really appreciated throughout this weekend. You all have exceeded my expectations. I asked you to be your best, and you did it. And I'm so proud of what you brought to this space. I think a space, this is what a real safe space looks like. Second, I want to thank the donors who make this possible. I want to thank the sponsors, the partners we had, Annette Kirk and the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Thank you, Annette, for being there year in and year out. But also, we've got the Progressive Women's Alliance of West Michigan being here year in and year out. Thank you. The Kate and Richard Walters Foundation, thank you for being here steadfastly, because you're the ones who make this project credible. We're not just going to be an enclave for conservatives. We're not just going to be an enclave for progressives. We're going to be an enclave where, in that middle ground, which is not squishy at all, we come together with the bedrocks of our principles. It's a very difficult space, but it's been handled beautifully. And finally, I want to say a word. They never get enough credit. I have the dream team of a staff. They have helped make this conference a wonderful experience for so many people. I can't tell you how many of you have come up to me and said, thank you to this great team. And they're standing in back there, and I'd like to give them a hand. Finally, stay tuned. We're going to have ProgCon 2018 next year, and I have very high expectations based on what I saw this year. Thank you so much for all your enthusiasm and participation. We are adjourned. Okay.